This is not just a story about a war, a dictator, or a nation swallowed by darkness. This is the true account of how one man, driven by hatred, fear, and obsession, dragged the world into its deadliest nightmare. A story written in blood, carved into the ruins of cities, and remembered by the millions whose lives he destroyed. This is the rise of a monster and the darkest fall in human history. What you are about to hear is not merely history, it is a warning. Before we begin, if you appreciate deep, powerful documentaries like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support helps us share more stories the world must never forget.
Adolf Hitler's story begins far from battlefields, power, and political influence. It begins in a quiet Austrian town called Braunau am Inn, where an ordinary-looking newborn would eventually become one of the most destructive figures in human history. He was born on April 20th, 1889, into a world that had no idea of the darkness he would later unleash. His early years did not hint at the horrors to come. Instead, they revealed a troubled and insecure boy who longed for recognition, acceptance, and purpose. But within him, the seeds of bitterness were already taking root, seeds that would one day grow into a storm of hatred, violence, and unimaginable cruelty. As a child, Hitler was shaped by contrasting forces. His father, Adolf Hitler, was strict, cold, and demanding, a man who valued discipline over affection. Alois expected obedience and held high expectations that his son often failed to meet. Their relationship was filled with tension, arguments, and punishment. Hitler's mother, Clara, on the other hand, was gentle and loving. She adored her son, shielding him from his father's harshness whenever she could. Hitler idolized her mother, and her kindness became the one source of warmth in an otherwise difficult childhood. But within him, the seeds of bitterness were already taking root, seeds that would one day grow into a storm of hatred, violence, and unimaginable cruelty. When Hitler was 18, he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. He was confident that he would be accepted. After all, he had put all his hopes and identity into this moment. But the Academy rejected him, not once, but twice. The rejection was devastating. His drawings lacked the depth and technique the Academy demanded. This failure struck Hitler brutally, chipping away at his self-esteem and deepening the resentment he carried toward society. Instead of accepting responsibility for his shortcomings, he began to search for others to blame. For years, Hitler wandered through Vienna, struggling to survive. He lived in hostels, took odd jobs, and sold small paintings on the street. Vienna was a diverse and multicultural city, a place of ideas, debates, and new ways of thinking. But Hitler gravitated toward the darkest influences available. He read extremist newspapers, listened to radical speakers, and absorbed every conspiracy theory he could find. These ideas fed his insecurities and strengthened his prejudices. In the isolation of his failures, he began to convince himself that Jews, immigrants, and minority groups were responsible for society's problems and for his own disappointments. But within him, the seeds of bitterness were already taking root, seeds that would one day grow into a storm of hatred, violence, and unimaginable cruelty. When World War I erupted in 1914, Hitler saw a chance to escape his miserable life. He left Austria, joined the German army, and finally felt like he belonged to something greater than himself. War gave him structure, identity, and a sense of mission he had never experienced before. He was not a remarkable soldier, but he was loyal, disciplined, and eager to serve. The war hardened him. It gave him pride, but also fed his anger. Germany's defeat in 1918 shattered Hitler. He could not accept that the mighty German Empire had fallen. He refused to believe the military had been defeated on the battlefield. Instead, he embraced the dangerous myth that Germany had been betrayed from within by traitors, politicians, intellectuals, and especially Jews. This lie would later become the central pillar of his ideology. After the war, Germany was in ruins. Its economy had collapsed, its people were starving, and its government was struggling to hold the country together. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed heavy penalties on Germany. Many Germans felt humiliated and angry. This national despair created the perfect opening for extremist voices to rise. Hitler found his opportunity in politics. He joined a small group called the German Workers' Party, but it didn't take him long to transform it into something far more dangerous. With his charisma and fiery speeches, he quickly climbed its ranks. The party grew under his influence, eventually becoming the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Hitler discovered that words were his greatest weapon. He could stand in front of a crowd and turn frustration into fury. He could take people's fears and point them toward a target. He promised hope, restoration, and pride, while quietly poisoning his followers with hatred. Crowds grew larger, his influence spread, and piece by piece, Hitler began to rebirth himself into the figure the world would soon fear. In 1923, convinced of his rising power, Hitler attempted to overthrow the government by force. The beer hall putsch was chaotic, unorganized, and ultimately a failure. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. But instead of ending his rise, prison amplified it. Hitler used his trial as a stage to present himself as a patriot, fighting for Germany's future. Many people admired his passion. During his imprisonment, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, a book that revealed the full extent of his twisted ideology. He wrote about racial superiority, the need for territorial expansion, and his desire to create a society purified of Jews and other groups he considered inferior. The world largely ignored this book, failing to see it as the warning it truly was. After being released from prison, Hitler changed his strategy. Instead of trying to seize power violently, he decided to pursue it legally. He rebuilt the Nazi Party from the ground up, using propaganda, fear, and manipulation to gain influence. The Great Depression of 1929 helped him tremendously. Millions of Germans lost their jobs, savings, and hope. Hitler promised solutions, and desperation made many people willing to listen. By 1933, Hitler successfully positioned himself as Chancellor of Germany. It was a moment that would change history forever. The man who had once lived in homeless shelters now stood at the head of a nation desperate for stability. From the moment he took office, Hitler wasted no time consolidating power. He eliminated political rivals, silenced the free press, and turned the government into a machine of control. The Reichstag fire, a suspicious event that remains debated, gave him the perfect excuse to seize emergency powers. Germany was no longer a democracy. It belonged to Hitler. Under his rule, hatred became law. Jews were banned from public life, stripped of rights, and targeted by propaganda. Hitler built a system designed to isolate, degrade, and eventually annihilate them. But his ambitions did not stop with discrimination. He wanted expansion. He rebuilt the German military, violating international agreements. He annexed Austria. He took over Czechoslovakia. The world watched anxiously, hoping to avoid another war. But Hitler had already begun planning one. And in this moment, at the height of his early power, the world had no idea that the man leading Germany was not a genius, not a visionary, but a monster driven by fear, insecurity, and hate. A man whose twisted beliefs would soon ignite the deadliest conflict humanity had ever known.
When Adolf Hitler secured the position of Chancellor in 1933, the future of Germany took a dark and irreversible turn. In the beginning, many Germans did not fully understand the danger he represented. To ordinary citizens, exhausted by poverty, unemployment, and political chaos, Hitler appeared as a strong and confident leader, someone who promised discipline, unity, and national revival. His speeches were fiery, emotional, and theatrical. His promises of restoring German pride felt like a lifeline to a nation desperately searching for hope. But behind the scenes, Hitler was already planning the total transformation of Germany into a dictatorship shaped entirely by his twisted ideology. One of Hitler's first moves was to neutralize all opposition. He understood that power meant silence, silencing critics, silencing rivals, and silencing anyone who dared question him. The Reichstag fire, which erupted mysteriously in February 1933, provided the perfect excuse. Blaming the fire on supposed communist conspirators, Hitler convinced President Paul von Hindenburg to pass the Reichstag fire decree. This decree suspended basic civil liberties, allowing the government to arrest political opponents, censor the press, and conduct raids without warrants. For Hitler, it was the beginning of total control. A few months later, the Enabling Act was introduced. With intense pressure and manipulation, Hitler persuaded the German parliament to pass it. The act effectively gave him the power to create laws without parliamentary consent. It was the moment democracy officially died in Germany. From that point forward, Hitler held absolute authority, and he wasted no time shaping the country into his own image. Hitler consolidated power through fear. The Gestapo, his secret police force, operated in the shadows of society. They monitored conversations, intercepted letters, and arrested anyone suspected of disloyalty. Silence became a survival strategy. Across Germany, individuals who had once spoken freely now whispered in private, afraid that a careless word could end their life. But fear alone did not secure Hitler's dominance. Propaganda became one of his most powerful tools. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, crafted a national narrative that portrayed Hitler as a heroic, almost divine figure destined to lead Germany to greatness. Radios were distributed to households so families could hear Hitler's speeches. Posters lined the streets depicting him as the savior of the nation. This relentless propaganda reshaped public perception. Children in schools learned that Hitler was their protector. Teachers praised him. Textbooks were rewritten. History was manipulated. Lies became truth in the eyes of millions. But beneath the surface of this constructed image, darkness spread. The Nazi regime introduced a series of laws targeting Jews, stripping them of rights and isolating them from society. Jewish people were banned from certain professions, required to register their property, and forced to live under increasingly oppressive conditions. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 were especially devastating. These laws defined Jewishness based on racial criteria, not religious affiliation. Jews were forbidden from marrying or even having relationships with non-Jewish Germans. They lost citizenship. Their humanity was systematically erased. For Hitler, these laws were only the beginning. His ultimate goal was the complete removal of Jews from German life. He envisioned a society built on racial purity, an ideology with no basis in science, morality, or reality. His hatred, born from insecurities and prejudices earlier in his life, had now become a state-enforced nightmare. But Hitler's ambitions were larger than internal oppression. He wanted expansion, territory that he believed belonged to Germany. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in a process known as the Anschluss. Many Austrians welcomed the union, believing that a greater Germany would bring prosperity. Across Europe, leaders watched uneasily, but hesitated to take action. Their desire to avoid another devastating war led to a strategy of appeasement. They hoped that giving Hitler what he wanted would calm his aggression. But appeasement only emboldened him. Later that same year, Hitler demanded control of the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. Through manipulation and political pressure, he succeeded in gaining the territory. British and French leaders, believing they had prevented conflict, signed the Munich Agreement. Hitler promised he would not seek more land, but his promise was a lie. By March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, an act that made it clear he had no intention of stopping. Europe stood on the brink of war, but Hitler was determined to push forward. He now set his sights on Poland. The invasion of Poland was not merely a military objective, it was a step toward Hitler's vision of a racially purified empire. He believed Poland would provide land for the master race he imagined. Hitler's preparations for war were meticulous. He strengthened alliances with Italy and Japan, forming the Axis powers. He expanded Germany's military capabilities, developed new strategies, and prepared propaganda to justify his aggression. But what truly emboldened him was his belief that no one would dare stop him. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland with overwhelming force. Bombers darkened the skies. Tanks rolled across borders. Civilians fled in terror. It was the beginning of World War II, the largest and deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. The speed of Germany's victory in Poland shocked the world. Poland resisted bravely, but was unable to withstand Germany's superior military power. Within weeks, the country collapsed. Britain and France declared war on Germany, fulfilling their promise to defend Poland. But at that moment, Hitler remained confident. He believed Germany could win a swift and powerful war that would reshape Europe. After Poland, Hitler turned his attention westward. In the spring of 1940, Germany unleashed a series of rapid military operations known as Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. Denmark and Norway fell quickly. Then came the invasion of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Each victory strengthened Hitler's belief in his destiny. France, one of Europe's strongest powers, collapsed in just 6 weeks. The world watched in disbelief as Hitler visited Paris, proudly observing the Eiffel Tower. For a moment, he seemed unstoppable. Germany now controlled vast regions of Europe, and Hitler stood at the height of his power.
Yet even in these moments of triumph, the true nature of his regime continued to reveal itself. Jews across Nazi-controlled territories faced increasing violence and persecution. Ghettos were established, forcing Jewish families into overcrowded, unsanitary, and deadly living conditions. Food was scarce, disease rampant. The ghettos were not just prisons, they were steps in a much darker plan. Hitler's hatred had evolved into a deadly strategy. Behind closed doors, Nazi officials discussed the final solution, a horrifying plan to systematically murder all Jews under German control. What began as discrimination had escalated into genocide. The world did not yet fully grasp the scale of what was unfolding, but inside Nazi headquarters, the wheels of a massive extermination machine were already turning. In 1940 and 1941, Hitler shifted his focus once more.
He planned to invade the Soviet Union, believing it would be his greatest victory. He saw the Soviet Union as a land to conquer, a resource to exploit, and a population to eliminate. His invasion plan, known as Operation Barbarossa, was the largest military operation in history. When Nazi forces launched the attack on June 22, 1941, Hitler believed he would defeat the Soviet Union in a matter of months. But this decision would become the turning point of the war, and ultimately the beginning of Hitler's downfall. What Hitler did not realize was that the Soviet Union, despite initial losses, possessed an immense military capacity and a resilience forged through hardship. The harsh Russian winter, combined with fierce resistance, stopped the German advance. Soldiers froze in the snow, ill-prepared for the brutal weather. Supplies ran low. The momentum that once made Hitler appear invincible began to crumble. And yet, even as his armies struggled, Hitler refused to acknowledge reality. His arrogance blinded him. He ignored the advice of his generals, insisting that retreat was unacceptable. He believed that sheer willpower could overcome strategy and weather. His delusions grew stronger, and his decisions became increasingly irrational. But the cost of his stubbornness was paid not by him, but by millions of soldiers and civilians. Cities burned. Families were torn apart. Lives were destroyed. The world was now fully engulfed in the consequences of one man's obsession with domination and hate. As the war stretched on, Hitler's grip on reality weakened. His military gambles had begun to fail. The enemy he had underestimated was closing in, and the empire he had built through fear, lies, and brutality was starting to crack. The monster who once felt unstoppable was about to face the beginning of his ultimate downfall.
Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union marked a turning point not only in the war, but in his own unraveling. Before Operation Barbarossa, he believed the world feared him, that Europe was bending to his will, and that his enemies were too weak to resist him. Blitzkrieg had made him feel invincible. But the invasion of the Soviet Union shattered that illusion. What began as a plan for swift conquest became a relentless nightmare, one that slowly dismantled the foundations of Hitler's empire. When German forces crossed the Soviet border in June 1941, they advanced with astonishing speed. Entire divisions were captured. Towns fell one after another. For a few months, it seemed as if Hitler's confidence had been justified. But beneath the appearance of success, cracks were beginning to form. Hitler had underestimated the vastness of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the brutality of its winters. He had miscalculated everything, from supply lines to morale to the determination of an enemy who would fight to the death. As autumn turned to winter, German soldiers found themselves trapped in conditions unlike anything they had experienced before. Temperatures dropped so low that weapons jammed and engines froze. Uniforms designed for Europe's mild winters offered little protection. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, newspapers, anything they could find. Frostbite devoured limbs. Thousands died without ever seeing an enemy soldier. Hitler, however, refused to adapt. He ordered his troops to stand their ground, convinced that victory was guaranteed if his soldiers simply refused to yield. It was a delusion, a dangerous one that cost countless lives. As German forces faltered, the Soviets regrouped, launching counterattacks that pushed the Germans back. The tide of the war was shifting, though Hitler refused to acknowledge it. While his army suffered in the east, Hitler intensified his campaign of hatred across Europe. Ghettos expanded, deportations increased. Extermination camps, designed with chilling efficiency, began to operate at full capacity. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek became factories of death. Millions of Jews, along with political prisoners, disabled individuals, Roma people, and others targeted by Nazi ideology, were systematically murdered. Hitler convinced himself that he was purifying the world, but in reality, he was destroying it. His hatred had grown into an industrial-scale genocide, carried out with bureaucratic precision. Trains arrived daily, delivering families who had no idea they were walking toward their death. Children clung to their mothers. Elderly men tried to stay strong, but inside the camps, humanity was stripped away. The cruelty was unimaginable, and the world would not fully comprehend the scale of the horror until years later. Despite these atrocities, Hitler maintained a facade of confidence. In public speeches, he presented himself as calm and in control. His propaganda machine continued to shape him as Germany's savior. But behind closed doors, his behavior grew erratic. He became increasingly isolated, distrustful of his own advisors. He surrounded himself with yes-men, people who feared him too much to tell him the truth. Anyone who questioned him, even gently, was dismissed or punished. As the war dragged on, Germany faced new enemies. In December 1941, the United States entered the war after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Hitler declared war on the United States, a decision fueled more by arrogance than strategy. He believed America was weak, that its soldiers lacked discipline, and that its democracy made it fragile. But he was wrong. American industry, manpower, and military strength would become a decisive force in the years to come. By 1942, Germany's situation was deteriorating. Resources were stretched thin. Factories struggled to keep up with demand. Cities faced food shortages. Yet Hitler continued to push for ambitious offensives. He launched an invasion toward the Caucasus to seize oil fields, believing that energy reserves would secure victory. But this campaign, like so many others, was doomed by his poor planning. The Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of his madness. Hitler refused to retreat, insisting that the city must be taken at any cost. The fighting was brutal. Soldiers battled street by street, building by building. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire. Winter arrived again, and the German army found itself surrounded. Starving, freezing, and outnumbered, the soldiers pleaded for permission to break out. Hitler denied them. He insisted they fight to the last man. When the German Sixth Army finally surrendered in February 1943, it was one of the most devastating defeats in military history. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Only a few thousand would ever return home. The loss shattered the illusion of German invincibility. It marked the moment when the world realized that Hitler's empire was not unstoppable. And though Hitler refused to admit it, the war had turned firmly against him. As defeats mounted, Hitler's paranoia deepened. He lashed out at generals, accusing them of betrayal. He micromanaged military operations despite knowing little about battlefield realities. He spent hours giving unrealistic orders, convinced that sheer willpower could turn the tide. His delusions became dangerous not only to his enemies, but to his own people. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Allies grew stronger. British and American forces launched strategic bombings over German cities, destroying factories, railways, and homes. The sky over Germany filled with fire as entire neighborhoods crumbled. Civilians sought shelter underground, listening as bombs shook the earth above them. Children cried, families prayed. Fear became a constant companion. Hitler, however, dismissed concerns about civilian suffering. He believed the German people must endure hardship for his vision. His speeches became increasingly unhinged, filled with fantasies of miracle weapons that would reverse the war. Propaganda spoke of secret technology, new missiles, new tanks, anything to keep morale from collapsing. But these promises were illusions. None of the miracle weapons would be enough to save Germany. In July 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler in the famous Operation Valkyrie. They planted a bomb in the room where he was meeting with top military leaders. The explosion killed several people and injured many others, but Hitler survived, protected by the placement of a heavy oak table leg that shielded him from the full force of the blast. His survival only heightened his sense of destiny. He interpreted it as a sign that fate protected him. The aftermath of Valkyrie was brutal. Hitler ordered mass executions. Anyone suspected of involvement, even indirectly, was arrested, tortured, and killed. The conspirators were hanged in gruesome fashion, their executions filmed for Hitler's personal satisfaction. The failed assassination attempt fueled his paranoia even further. He trusted almost no one. His circle of advisors shrank. His decisions became more erratic.
Meanwhile, the Allies closed in from both sides. In June 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces launched the D-Day invasion, landing on the beaches of Normandy. It was one of the largest military operations in history. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies broke through German defenses and began pushing across France. Paris was liberated in August. City by city, town by town, German forces retreated. In the east, the Soviet Union made sweeping advances. The Red Army reclaimed territory lost earlier in the war and pressed deeper into German-held lands. Millions of Soviet soldiers marched westward, driven by rage and determination. They had witnessed the destruction Hitler brought to their homeland. They were coming for justice and revenge. By late 1944, Germany was collapsing. Hitler, refusing to accept reality, ordered a massive counterattack in the Ardennes region, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a desperate gamble, relying on the element of surprise. For a brief moment, German forces made progress, catching the Allies off guard. But once Allied troops regrouped, the offensive crumbled. Germany no longer had the fuel, manpower, or resources to sustain such operations. Hitler's health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from tremors. His movements became stiff. Some of his closest aides believed he was experiencing the early stages of Parkinson's disease. He isolated himself inside the Reich Chancellery bunker in Berlin, a concrete maze buried beneath the city. There, surrounded by loyalists and cut off from the outside world, he spent his final months. The bunker was a dark, claustrophobic place. Air was stale. Lights flickered. Explosions from Soviet artillery echoed constantly overhead. Hitler's world had shrunk to a series of narrow hallways and dimly lit rooms. He held meetings late into the night, ranting about betrayal, issuing impossible commands, and fantasizing about armies that no longer existed. Above ground, Berlin was turning to ashes. Buildings collapsed, streets were filled with rubble. Civilians fled as Soviet forces advanced. The once proud capital of the Reich was becoming a graveyard of Hitler's ambitions. By April 1945, Germany was in ruins. The Allies approached from the west. The Soviets closed in from the east. Germany was trapped, and defeat was inevitable. Yet, Hitler refused to leave Berlin. He chose to stay, clinging to the fantasy that he would somehow turn the tide. But deep down, he knew the truth. The monster who once sought to rule the world now faced the end of his madness. The walls around him were literally closing in, and outside, the world he had tried to dominate was rising against him. His downfall, long delayed by violence, lies, and fear, was finally approaching. And in the darkness of his bunker, Adolf Hitler began his final descent into the madness that would consume him completely.
By the beginning of 1945, Berlin no longer resembled the proud capital of a powerful empire. The city was a wounded, burning corpse of stone and dust. Buildings lay shattered, streets had collapsed into trenches, and the once familiar landscape was turned into a maze of rubble. Smoke choked the air. Fires glowed through the night like open wounds. Civilians huddled in basements, listening to the thunder of artillery that never stopped. Every explosion reminded them that the war Hitler had unleashed was now coming home with full force. Hitler, however, refused to face reality. He shut himself inside the Führerbunker, a hidden labyrinth beneath the Reich Chancellery. It was a place of cold concrete, stale air, and flickering lamps. Guards patrolled the cramped corridors. Typists worked in dim rooms. The constant rumble of artillery echoed through the walls. Above them, the city collapsed under Soviet bombardment. Below, Hitler clung to fantasies that no longer had any connection to the world outside. The bunker became Hitler's final kingdom, a world built on denial, paranoia, and desperation. In these claustrophobic rooms, he made decisions that would seal the fate of millions. He held daily briefings, poring over maps with shaking hands. The lines on the maps represented divisions that no longer existed, ghost armies fighting imaginary battles. His generals tried to speak honestly, but Hitler dismissed every report that contradicted his beliefs. He screamed at officers, accused them of treason, and demanded they carry out impossible orders. In the bunker, his physical condition deteriorated. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his posture collapsed. He shuffled rather than walked, his movements stiff with disease. His skin grew pale and thin. His eyes, once fiery with ambition, became sunken and hollow. Even those who had followed him for years were shocked by his decline. The monster who had terrorized continents now resembled a frail, broken man. Yet his cruelty remained unchanged. Those who stayed in the bunker lived under an atmosphere of dread. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, joined him underground despite multiple opportunities to escape. She had spent years in the background, invisible to the public, but in the end she chose to share his downfall. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's devoted propagandist, also brought his family into the bunker, his wife Magda, and their 6 children. They believed so fully in Hitler's vision that they chose death over surrender. As April unfolded, Soviet forces encircled Berlin. Street by street, they pushed closer. The German army, once feared across the world, was now reduced to teenagers, old men, and exhausted soldiers with little ammunition left. They fought bravely, but the battle was hopeless. The Soviet artillery pounded Berlin relentlessly. The ground shook day and night. The sky burned with smoke. Hitler still believed rescue was coming. He fantasized that Field Marshal Wenck's army would break through the Soviet lines and save Berlin. He believed units that were already destroyed were still fighting. He believed reinforcements would appear out of thin air. Every hour he demanded reports of armies that existed only in his imagination. His generals, trapped between fear and despair, tried to reason with him, but Hitler had left reality long behind. Food in the bunker became scarce. Sleep was rare. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and despair. Hitler spent hours in meetings, then retreated to his private room where he paced obsessively, muttering to himself. He ranted about betrayal, blaming officers, civilians, even the German people for failing him. He refused to accept responsibility for the destruction he had caused. Above ground, Berlin was no longer defensible. Soviet troops advanced rapidly, capturing important districts. Fires spread uncontrollably. Civilians fled through the streets, dodging bullets and rubble. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Bodies lay uncollected, buried beneath debris. The city was dying. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, he emerged briefly from the bunker to greet a group of young Hitler Youth soldiers. Their faces were pale, frightened, and far too young to be fighting a war. Hitler trembled as he shook their hands. Many of them would be dead within days. After the ceremony, Hitler returned underground. It would be the last time he saw daylight. By April 22nd, the situation was beyond hopeless. Hitler held a tense meeting in the bunker map room. His generals explained that Berlin could not be saved. Wenck's army could not reach them. Steiner's attack, a plan Hitler had insisted on, had never actually occurred. For the first time, the truth pierced Hitler's delusion. He collapsed into a chair, visibly defeated. Witnesses described him as a man whose spirit had finally broken. He muttered that the war was lost and that he had been betrayed by everyone. It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging the reality he had created. From that moment on, Hitler abandoned all thoughts of strategy. He no longer cared about the war or his country. Instead, he turned inward, focused solely on his own death. He told his staff that he would not leave Berlin. He would not surrender. He would not be captured alive. He declared that he would die in the bunker and have his body burned so that no enemy could claim him. On April 29, 1945, as artillery thundered above, Hitler married Eva Braun in a small ceremony inside the bunker. She signed her new name, Eva Hitler, with shaky hands. A short celebration followed, a few glasses of champagne, a brief congratulations from staff, and the somber understanding that they would not live to see another sunrise. Later that night, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. In it, he blamed the Jews for everything, accused his generals of betrayal, and expressed no remorse for the destruction he had caused. Even in his final hours, he clung to hatred and delusion. Meanwhile, Soviet troops fought their way into central Berlin. They stormed government buildings, closing in on the Reich Chancellery. Gunfire echoed through the streets. Tanks crushed the remains of walls and burnt out cars. The Red Army advanced relentlessly. In the bunker, the tension became unbearable. Every hour brought news of Soviet troops getting closer. On April 30, 1945, Hitler knew it was over. In the early afternoon, he retired to his private quarters with Eva Braun. Witnesses recalled that he appeared unusually calm. Moments later, a gunshot echoed through the bunker. Hitler had shot himself while biting down on a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun took cyanide beside him. When staff entered the room, they found Hitler slumped on a sofa, blood pooling on the armrest, and Eva lifeless beside him. The man who had plunged the world into war died in silence, hidden beneath the ruins of his failed empire. Following his instructions, staff carried the bodies outside into the garden above the bunker. Enemy fire shook the ground as they poured gasoline over the corpses and set them on fire. Flames consumed their bodies, sending smoke into the bomb-scarred spy. But even in death, Hitler could not escape the devastation he created. Berlin was collapsing. Germany was surrendering. His ideology was crumbling. The monster was gone, but the wounds he inflicted would scar the world for generations. Inside the bunker, chaos erupted. Some staff attempted to escape. Others committed suicide. Joseph Goebbels and his wife made a monstrous decision. Believing that a world without Nazi socialism was not worth living in, they poisoned their 6 children while they slept. Then they killed themselves. Their children, innocent victims of fanaticism, never had a chance. Above ground, the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was nearing its end. Families poured out of bomb shelters, dazed and broken. Soldiers surrendered in masses. The streets filled with silence, an eerie calm after years of destruction.
Hitler's death did not bring immediate peace. The aftermath of the war revealed horrors the world had only heard rumors about. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps, they found mountains of bodies, starving survivors, and evidence of atrocities so vast that even the liberators struggled to comprehend them. The full scale of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, shocked humanity to its core. In cities across Europe, survivors tried to rebuild their lives. Many returned to find their homes destroyed, their families gone, and their communities erased. Entire cultures had been shattered. Nations lay in ruins. The world had changed forever. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. High-ranking Nazi officials were brought to justice for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Evidence presented at the trials revealed the depth of Nazi brutality. Documents, testimonies, and footage showed the horrifying efficiency of Hitler's extermination system. Some defendants tried to deny responsibility. Others claimed they were just following orders. But the world now knew the truth. Hitler's ideology was not just evil, it was catastrophic. Hitler's legacy became a symbol of absolute darkness. Scholars, historians, psychologists, and world leaders would spend decades trying to understand how one man, fueled by resentment and hatred, rose to such power and left such devastation in his wake. His story became a warning, a reminder of the dangers of fanaticism, propaganda, and blind obedience. Decades after his death, Hitler's impact still echoes across continents. His actions reshaped borders, destroyed millions of lives, and left painful scars on the collective memory of humanity. His rise reveals how fragile democracy can be when people are desperate and misled. His fall shows that hatred ultimately destroys itself. In the ruins of Berlin, the world witnessed the end of a nightmare. But the responsibility to remember, accurately, honestly, and fully, remains. Because forgetting invites repetition, and the horrors unleashed by Hitler must never be repeated.
The fall of Adolf Hitler did not end with the gunshot that echoed through the bunker. His physical death silenced him, but the consequences of his actions continued to unfold long after his body was reduced to ashes. As the war came to its official end and the world surveyed the destruction he left behind, a new chapter began, one defined by reckoning, rebuilding, trauma, and the slow attempt to understand how so much devastation had come from the ambitions of a single man. When Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. Silence settled across battlefields that had once thundered with explosions. The guns stopped. Soldiers laid down their weapons. Cities, scarred by bombings, fire, and rubble, stood still for the first time in years. But the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, filled with grief, confusion, and a deep sense of loss. From Berlin to Warsaw, from Vienna to Paris, millions stepped out of hiding into a world that looked unfamiliar, broken, battered, and deeply wounded. The full extent of Hitler's destruction was impossible to grasp at first. Entire cities were reduced to skeletons of concrete and metal. Families searched the ruins for loved ones whose fate was unknown. Trains no longer ran. Water systems failed. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. The war had taken everything: homes, resources, and millions of lives. But worst of all, it had stolen hope. As Allied troops advanced deeper into Nazi-occupied territories during the final months of the war, They uncovered the reality behind Hitler's regime. The liberation of concentration camps remains one of the haunting moments in human history. Soldiers who'd prepared for battle found instead an unimaginable nightmare: bodies stacked like firewood, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoriums still warm, and survivors whose frail, skeletal figures seemed barely alive. Many wept openly. Hardened soldiers, accustomed to violence, were overwhelmed by the scale of what they saw. The crimes were so vast that they seemed unreal until the survivors spoke. Children who had watched their families die, mothers who had hidden scraps of bread for months, men who had endured years of torture, starvation, and forced labor. Their stories exposed the monstrous reality of Hitler's ideology. The world realized that his hatred had not been symbolic. It had been systematic, intentional, and relentless. Across Europe, the liberation of camps triggered a wave of shock and anger. Newspapers published photographs of the horrors. Radio broadcasts described the scenes with trembling voices. People who had once doubted the rumors about Nazi atrocities now faced undeniable truth. The world was forced to confront the consequences of silence and inaction, and for many, that realization would burn for the rest of their lives. In the months following Hitler's death, Allied forces divided Germany into occupied zones. The country that once sought to dominate the world was now partitioned, disarmed, and placed under strict supervision. The Allies dismantled Nazi institutions, arrested key officials, and began the long process of denazification, an effort to remove traces of Hitler's ideology from German society. Schools rewrote textbooks, statues were removed, swastikas were banned, leaders were prosecuted. But cleansing the nation of Hitler's influence was not simply a matter of removing symbols. His ideology had infected generations. Many Germans had supported him willingly. Others had complied out of fear. Untangling truth from propaganda, loyalty from coercion, guilt from survival, this became one of the greatest challenges Germany ever faced. Some Germans claimed ignorance. Others said they had no choice. A few admitted their involvement, but the shadow of Hitler hung over everyone. The Nuremberg trials became the world's attempt to bring justice to the victims. Held from 1945 to 1946, these trials brought high-ranking Nazi leaders before an international tribunal. Judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union presided. For the first time in history, the world put individuals on trial for crimes against humanity. The courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, and survivors seeking answers. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Documents meticulously recorded mass extermination. Photographs showed atrocities that defied imagination. Testimonies from survivors and liberators revealed the darkest depths of cruelty. Some defendants broke down, unable to accept their guilt. Others remained defiant, insisting they were innocent. Many used the infamous defense, "I was only following orders." But the judges did not accept this justification. They declared that moral responsibility cannot be erased by obedience. Several Nazi leaders were sentenced to death. Others received long prison sentences. The trial sent a clear message: Hitler's crimes would not disappear with his death. Those who helped him would face consequences. But while justice was served to some, it could never undo the suffering inflicted on millions. As the world processed the aftermath of Hitler's tyranny, Germany itself faced a monumental task: survival. The physical damage was staggering. Cities needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Roads and bridges and factories required repair. Millions of refugees wandered the continent, searching for safe places to live. Hunger was widespread. Rations were strict. Winter brought new hardships. But despite all of this, the German people began rebuilding. Brick by brick, they reconstructed their homes. Street by street, they restored their towns. And slowly, painfully, they attempted to rebuild their lives. Hitler's fall also marked a shift in global politics. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union dissolved into mistrust. The world, exhausted by fascism, now braced for a new conflict, the Cold War. Europe became a battleground of ideologies, divided between communist East and democratic West. Germany itself was split into two nations, East Germany under Soviet influence and West Germany aligned with the West. Berlin, torn apart by walls and barbed wire, became the epicenter of this new rivalry. Hitler had wanted a unified empire. Instead, his legacy left Europe fractured for decades. But beyond politics and borders, Hitler's downfall forced humanity to confront deeper questions. How did he rise? Why did people follow him? Could such evil appear again? Scholars debated the psychology of dictatorship, the vulnerability of democracy, and the dangers of propaganda. Teachers around the world used Hitler's story as a lesson, a warning that hatred does not begin with violence. It begins with words, with fear, with lies, and if left unchecked, it can grow into something catastrophic. For Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and countless others, the end of the war did not erase trauma. Survivors carried scars, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Many had nowhere to go. Entire families had been erased. Communities vanished. Some survivors emigrated to new countries, seeking safety and a chance to rebuild. Others tried to re-establish their lives in Europe, haunted by memories they could never forget. Their resilience became one of the most powerful testaments to human strength. Hitler's life and death left behind contradictions that scholars still examine. How could a man with no remarkable talents rise to such power? How could a society known for its art, culture, and intellect embrace such hatred? How could millions participate in or ignore crimes so vast? There is no single answer. His rise was a combination of economic desperation, national humiliation, political instability, and dangerous propaganda. His fall was the inevitable result of hatred turning inward. One of the greatest ironies of Hitler's legacy is that he achieved the opposite of what he intended. Instead of creating a racially pure empire, he left Germany divided, weakened, and disgraced. Instead of securing the future of the so-called Aryan race, he brought destruction to his own people. Instead of achieving immortality through greatness, he became a global symbol of evil, a name spoken with shame and disgust. His dream died with him, buried under the rubble of Berlin.
Years after his death, the site of the bunker where Hitler spent his final days was destroyed, buried beneath concrete and paved over. No monuments, no plaques, no signs mark the spot. Germany chose to erase the physical space where he died, ensuring it could never become a shrine for extremism. Today, it's nothing more than a parking lot surrounded by apartment buildings, an unremarkable place hiding a dark history beneath its surface. But while the bunker disappeared, the memory of what happened there remains. Hitler's story stands as one of the world's most important lessons. Evil does not always appear with warning. It can begin quietly, disguised as hope. It can grow slowly, fed by fear, anger, and ignorance. It can take root in ordinary people who believe they are doing the right thing. And if left unchallenged, it can destroy everything.
The fall of Hitler also marked the beginning of a new effort to protect human rights worldwide. The United Nations was founded, in part, to prevent such atrocities from happening again. International laws were created to protect civilians, refugees, and minorities. Nations pledged never to allow genocide to repeat. And for decades, the world has worked, imperfectly but persistently, to uphold these promises. But Hitler's shadow still lingers. Neo-Nazi movements, extremist ideologies, and hate groups occasionally emerge in different parts of the world. Their existence serves as a warning that the fight against hatred is never finished. It must be confronted with education, courage, and truth. Hitler's rise and fall revealed the fragility of peace, the danger of silence, and the importance of remembering. The world cannot change the past, but it can learn from it. And in the story of Hitler, there is one undeniable truth. No matter how powerful evil may seem, it ultimately destroys itself. As Europe rebuilt from ashes, as survivors stitched together the fragments of their lives, and as nations vowed never to forget, one message became clear. Hitler's legacy would not be defined by his ambition, but by the lives of those who endured and overcame the darkness he unleashed.
In the years after Hitler's death, the world struggled to understand how a single individual could have unleashed such devastation. The war had ended, but its consequences lingered everywhere, etched into landscapes, carried in the hearts of survivors, and woven into the collective memory of nations. Cities could be rebuilt, but trust, innocence, and peace required far more time to recover. Even as nations moved forward, Hitler's shadow stretched long across the ruins he left behind. The post-war era was one of reckoning. People returned to their homes only to find rubble where entire neighborhoods once stood. Families searched for loved ones who had disappeared, soldiers missing in action, prisoners lost in camps, civilians swallowed by the chaos of war. Many never found answers. Names remained unclaimed in mass graves. Photographs were discovered in abandoned suitcases. Letters were left unsent. Hitler had not only destroyed lives, he had erased histories. In the midst of this devastation, Allied forces worked to stabilize Europe. They delivered food, restored water, and rebuilt essential infrastructure. The Marshall Plan, a massive American initiative, poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe. Roads were repaired, factories reopened, and schools were rebuilt. Germany, the nation Hitler had promised would be the greatest in history, now relied on the generosity of former enemies to survive. But rebuilding cities was only part of the challenge. Hitler's ideology had seeped into society over more than a decade. It had shaped children, manipulated adults, and divided communities. The process of denazification, though imperfect, aimed to root out remaining loyalty to the regime. Former Nazi Party members were investigated. Teachers who had preached Hitler's ideology were replaced. Streets were renamed, monuments destroyed. But erasing symbols did not erase trauma. Some Germans confronted their past with shame and remorse. Others denied responsibility. Still others clung to the belief that Hitler had been misunderstood. This denial disturbed the world, prompting scholars and psychologists to examine how ordinary people had been persuaded to commit extraordinary crimes. Their studies revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature, that fear, ignorance, and loyalty can be twisted into weapons. Hitler had exploited these vulnerabilities masterfully. Meanwhile, survivors who had endured Hitler's cruelty faced the enormous task of rebuilding their own lives. Many were stateless, their homes destroyed and their families gone. They wandered Europe seeking refuge. Some settled in Israel,
established in 1948 as a homeland for Jewish people after the Holocaust. Others emigrated to the United States, Canada, or South America. Some chose to remain in Europe, determined to rebuild the communities Hitler had tried to eradicate. Their resilience was staggering. Survivors married, raised families, built businesses, and pursued education. They wrote memoirs, testified in trials, and opened museums. Their existence became a rebuke to Hitler's ideology, a living reminder that hatred could not extinguish hope. But they also carried lifelong scars. Many suffered nightmares, anxiety, and survivor's guilt. The world admired their strength, but often failed to recognize their pain. For decades, Hitler's story compelled historians to search for explanations. How did a failed artist rise to absolute power? How did millions follow him with such devotion? Why did the world not stop him sooner? Scholars examined economic conditions, political instability, social frustrations, cultural wounds left by World War I, and the seductive power of propaganda. Their conclusions were complex, but one truth was clear. Hitler had exploited fear, anger, and division to build his empire.
He promised restoration to a nation humiliated by defeat. He offered simple answers to complex problems. He created enemies where none existed. And in times of uncertainty, such lies can be dangerously persuasive. The world learned that democracy is fragile, not destroyed by bombs alone, but by apathy, ignorance, and deception. Hitler had manipulated democratic systems to gain power. He had used freedom of speech to poison public discourse. He had appealed to emotion rather than reason. His rise was a warning to future generations that hatred thrives where truth is ignored. As decades passed, Hitler's name became synonymous with evil. His actions became a reference point for cruelty, tyranny, and genocide. In classrooms, textbooks detailed his crimes. Films depicted his madness. Museums displayed artifacts of his regime. Memorials honored the victims. The world vowed to remember, not for admiration, but for prevention. But memory alone was not enough. Extremist ideologies continued to appear across the world. Hate groups adopted symbols eerily similar to the ones Hitler had championed. Some denied the Holocaust. Others glorified Hitler as a misunderstood genius. These distortions of history underscored the need for constant vigilance. Truth needed defenders, and education became a weapon against ignorance. Germany itself underwent a profound transformation. The new nation rejected Hitler's legacy completely. It reconstructed its identity around democracy, human rights, and humility. German leaders apologized publicly for the atrocities of the past. Schools taught students about the Holocaust extensively, ensuring younger generations understood the weight of their history. Memorials rose in cities where Hitler once spoke. The country became one of the strongest advocates for peace and international cooperation. Berlin, once the heart of Hitler's empire, grew into a symbol of unity. The Berlin Wall, erected during the Cold War, fell in 1989. The image of Germans tearing it down with hammers and bare hands became a powerful metaphor. The rejection of division, tyranny, and hate. The city rebuilt itself into a vibrant, multicultural place where the scars of history were not hidden, but acknowledged. Visitors today can walk through the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, a haunting field of concrete slabs that evokes the lost lives of millions. They can see remnants of the Berlin Wall, explore museums dedicated to resistance movements, and visit historical sites transformed into places of learning. Germany does not hide its past. It faces it openly, knowing that remembrance is the strongest safeguard against repetition. Hitler's impact also reshaped global justice. The Nuremberg trials established legal precedents for prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity. These principles influenced the creation of the International Criminal Court decades later. The world gained new tools to hold dictators and war criminals accountable. Hitler never faced justice in a courtroom, but his followers did, and the world ensured that such crimes would never again be unpunished. Even as the world moved forward, questions lingered. Could another Hitler rise? Could society fall for such deception again? History showed that no nation is immune to manipulation. Hatred can appear anywhere, disguised as patriotism, faith, or righteousness. Hitler's story became a warning carved into time, that evil feeds on indifference, and silence can be as dangerous as violence. It also revealed something else: the extraordinary resilience of humanity. Despite all the destruction Hitler caused, life continued. Children were born in the ruins, couples married and churches missing their roofs, artists painted amid the rubble, schools reopened, scientists advanced medicine and technology, communities rebuilt, nations healed. The world, broken but unbowed, proved stronger than Hitler's cruelty. His dream of domination died with him. His ideology collapsed beneath the weight of truth. His empire, built on lies and violence, crumbled to dust. But the people he tried to destroy lived on, each life a testament to courage. Today, Hitler is remembered not as a leader or a visionary, but as the embodiment of human darkness. His name carries the weight of millions of lives lost. His story is studied not for inspiration, but for warning. And every time the world tells his story, it does so with one mission: to ensure that no future generation forgets the cost of hatred. History does not erase mistakes, it preserves them so they can never be repeated. Hitler's rise shows how dangerous it is to give power to anger. His rule shows how fragile freedom becomes in the hands of a tyrant. His fall shows that even the most terrifying regimes can be defeated when the world stands united. And so, Adolf Hitler remains a grim chapter in the human story, one defined not by triumph, but by tragedy. A chapter we continue to revisit, not to dwell in darkness, but to protect the light. Because remembering him is not honoring him, it is safeguarding the world from the darkness he unleashed. In the end, the most important part of Hitler's story is not his rise, his power, or even his death. It is what humanity chose to do afterward: rebuild, remember, and rise above the hatred that nearly consumed the world. His legacy is a warning carved into time, and the world carries it forward so that the future will never again walk the path he once forced upon it. And that is why his story must be told, not to elevate the monster he became, but to remind the world that monsters can rise when people look away, and that they fall when courage, truth, and unity stand against them.